Today, we are dealing with the case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, one of the most bizarre cases of our time involving a religious cult. 5 deaths, 2 missing persons, and many questions. The story begins in San Bernardino, California. Lori Daybell, also known as Lori Vallow Daybell, was born on June 26, 1973, as Lori Noreen Cox. Her parents are Janice Lee Cox and Barry Lynn Cox. There was nothing special or unusual about Lori's childhood. In 1992, at the age of 19, she married Nelson Yanes, a young man she was with in high school. However, their happy marriage didn't last long, and they divorced after about a year. 2 years later, she remarried a man named William LaJoya in 1995. Things went well. They had a child, a boy named Colby Ryan. They were together for 3 years, but in 1998, Lori divorced William. After another 3 years, she married for the 3rd time, this time to a man named Joseph Anthony Ryan in 2001. Later, they had a child, a girl named Tylee Ryan. However, this marriage did not last long, and in 2004, Lori and Joseph divorced. It did not start well, as after Lori told her brother Alex that Ryan had abused and mistreated her, Alex attacked Joseph and threatened to kill him. This led to Alex being sentenced to 90 days in jail and 5 years probation. Lori was an attractive woman and had charm, but her sense of adventure and enthusiasm knew no bounds, and she was often disappointed. In 2005, Lori was single again, and although she had 2 children, she only cared for one, Tylee. In 2005, she met another man named Charles Vallow. Charles was a hard-working, tall, and handsome man. Moreover, he was always well-dressed. He came from a large family he never forgot. He was born on August 17, 1956, in Arizona. He met Lori when he was 49, but he looked younger and more energetic. Shortly thereafter, Lori married Charles on February 24, 2006. At that time, Charles already had 2 children from a previous marriage, Nicholas and Zachary. However, that didn't stop them from bringing their big family together under one roof. Charles's children, Lori and her 2 children, began living together. This family could be described as happy in every way. Charles was a relatively successful businessman and supported his family, while Lori was not a hard worker. Although she had worked as a hairdresser before marrying Charles, she quit her job after the wedding. Their family life was sometimes a bit strange. During summer vacations, Charles' children would spend time at their house, but Charles himself was not there. He was busy with work. Lori was usually with her family or friends, and Charles's children were often only with Lori's children, Tylee and Colby. In 2014, Charles and Lori decided to adopt Charles' great-nephew, Joshua Jackson Vallow. In 2015, when they were living on the island of Kauai, Lori became fascinated with a series of books titled Standing on Sacred Grounds. By many criteria, Lori could already be considered a Mormon at this point, as she had intensely explored the religion. At a certain point, the books became as essential to her as air, and she became almost obsessed with them. These books were written by a religious author named Chad Daybell, and from that moment on, she never forgot his name. In 2016, Lori's fascination with religious books grew even stronger. One day in the fall of 2018, she and her friend Melanie attended an event called Preparing a People. It was a religious event where Lori met Chad Daybell. According to her friend Melanie, Chad told Lori at the end of the weekend that he and she had been married in their past 7 lives. The two began texting after the event, and it didn't take long for passion to ignite. A few weeks later, when Charles was on a business trip, Lori invited Chad to her home. However, there was no hot night, as Lori had also invited her friend Melanie and a few other followers of Chad's ideas, and they all discussed the deep secrets of God. Chad kept his eye on Lori that evening and often put her in the spotlight. Chad Daybell was a strange man. He was born on August 11, 1968, and grew up in Provo, his hometown in Utah County. As a teenager, he met Tamara, and they got married 2 years later. He earned a degree in journalism from Brigham Young University. He was not particularly wealthy. His first job was digging graves in local cemeteries. This changed in 2004 when Chad founded his own company, a publishing house called Spring Creek Books. Chad had published over 25 of his books. half of which were the books Lori later became obsessed with. He moved his family to Rexburg. Incidentally, he and Tamara had 5 children and claimed that the Lord had commanded him to do so. Chad divided all people into people of light and people of darkness, categorizing them into levels and stages. He believed that the dark people came from this earth, but were followers of Satan, while those he considered people of light were followers of Jesus Christ. Chad told Lori that evening when she invited him to visit that he believed she was an eternal being who had lived 21 lives, 5 of which were on planet Earth, the same number of lives as him. Lori not only believed him but was also thrilled and fascinated by it. She was obsessed with her new life purpose and also with Chad. The two remained in constant contact after this meeting, and in October 2018, Chad contacted Lori via email to send her a map and lists of spirits of light and darkness, and to finally include her family and children in his system. So let's move to the year 2019. The Vallow family had returned from the island to Arizona 2 years earlier, and by this time, Charles and Lori's marriage had begun to slowly but surely fall apart. Lori was devoting more and more time to her religion, which had now become a kind of cult. She was increasingly withdrawing from her everyday life, becoming estranged, and her worldview became more eccentric. She was entirely consumed by the concept of light and dark people. Those she considered dark, she called zombies. She also believed she was an immortal spirit sent to lead especially protected chosen ones by God. Charles and Lori began arguing daily, and by this point, their marriage was on the brink of collapse. On January 31st, Charles was on a business trip. It was a Thursday. He had been away for a week and had not been in contact with his children for 2 days. When he arrived at the airport, he still hadn't heard from Lori and the children, and his car was missing from the parking lot where it had been parked. He took a taxi home. When he got there, he found that his keys didn't fit the lock. His belongings were in a trash can, and $35,000 was missing from his account. The man then called the police, and the officers came to his house. When asked what was going on, Charles replied, "How can I explain this? We have a Mormon here who thinks she's a rebellious being and believes she's God, and Jesus will come next year. She took all the money from my bank account. My car is gone from the airport. She took it, and basically, all the cars are gone." When the man entered the yard, he found that all the family cars and much more were missing. Charles also told the police that his wife had threatened him, but they didn't take his words seriously. Police officers even scolded him once or twice for wasting their time. Lori disappeared for 58 days during this time. Charles filed for divorce, although he feared for his life and that Lori would put them in danger, and the police didn't want to get involved. Indeed, she returned to Hawaii with her daughter Tylee and stayed there for almost 2 months. Now let's move on to the next part of the story. On July 11, 2019, in the early morning hours, a man called 911 and reported that he had killed a man. This man was Alex Cox, Lori's brother, and he had killed Lori's husband, Charles. At that time, Lori was driving Joshua to school while her brother Alex and her daughter Tylee were at home. Charles arrived at this time. According to Alex, Charles approached the house in a fit of rage, and while Tylee went to get a baseball bat, an argument broke out between Alex and Charles. Tylee returned with the bat, but Charles grabbed it from her and hit Alex on the head. Alex then took the gun and shot him several times in the chest. Charles died in the living room. The police found him a few minutes later. You would think the family would be in shock, but no. What was particularly suspicious was Lori's behavior. She was caught on camera at the crime scene, joking and even laughing about the situation. But even more suspicious were her actions a few hours later. Lori held a pool party at her house just a few meters away from where her ex-husband had died only hours before. Let's return to the crime scene. Alex tended to his wounds while the police questioned him. Although he claimed Charles had hit him on the back of the head with a bat, the injury was surprisingly light. But Charles was a semi-professional baseball player. If he had hit Alex on the head with a bat, he would have been dead. The police later released Alex without further questioning, stating it was self-defense. The next day, Charles's children, Nicholas and Zachary, learned of their father's death, only through text message. Lori chose not to call, and unlike the others, they were stunned by the news. Not surprisingly, Lori, along with Joshua and Tylee, soon left Arizona. They moved to Rexburg. After Charles died, the three began to settle into their new home in Idaho. However, Lori's story became even more horrific in the following months. In early September, she sent Joshua to a nearby school, but did not do the same for her daughter Tylee. It was Saturday, September 8, 2019, and Lori drove with her children and her brother Alex, Yellowstone National Park. If you look at the photos taken there, you can see that the family was happy, but this is the last time Tylee is seen. No one ever saw her again. She just disappeared. And surprisingly, Lori didn't even report it to the police. She simply stayed silent. And since Lori had just arrived with her children at her new home, no one noticed her daughter was missing. Joshua went to his new school for the first time the next day and seemed to settle in well. He even made some friends in the neighborhood. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, he was seen playing with a friend on the street in front of his new home in Rexburg. The doorbell camera caught the boy as he ran home, but that was the last time anyone saw him. On September 23rd, Lori called the school to withdraw her son from school. When asked by the principal, she replied that he had simply switched to homeschooling. And that was it. Joshua disappeared. Over the next 3 months, friends and other relatives of Tylee and Joshua became increasingly worried. To anyone who asked about the children, Lori said they were fine. She said they were either visiting friends or relatives. But despite all these statements, no one had seen them for weeks. During this time, 2 things happened. The first was that Lori started visiting a warehouse near Rexburg. On October 1st, 2019, she was caught by surveillance cameras bringing her belongings, such as children's bikes, scooters, and blankets there. The next day, the story continued. It is not entirely clear who she was with, but judging by the way he walked, it was probably Chad Daybell, who of course lived in Rexburg, Idaho. In total, Lori, her brother Alex, and Chad visited the warehouse 9 times in October and once more in November. The second event, however, was far more eerie. On October 9th, Chad's wife Tamara was unloading groceries from her car in the driveway. At that moment, a masked man with a paintball gun approached her. When she turned to look at him, he opened fire. The woman started screaming and called Chad for help, and the attacker immediately ran away. Tamara then wrote on her Facebook page, "Something very strange happened, and I want you all to know and be careful. I drove up to the house and parked in the front driveway. As I was getting the bags out of the back of the car, suddenly, a man with a ski mask and a paintball gun was behind my car. He shot several times at me. I have no idea what his motive was. He didn't say anything, although I asked him several times what he intended." Tamara had been through a tough time. This attack clearly frightened her, but that wasn't the worst part because, 10 days later, Chad called 911 to report that Tamara had died. Apparently, she died in her sleep in their house. Investigators visited the apartment and deemed the death natural. However, when they offered to perform an autopsy, Chad hesitantly refused. The investigators found this reaction strange, but accepted his refusal without further questioning. Let's summarize this part of the story. We have Lori Vallow with her husband and 2 children. The husband is now dead, and the children are missing. We also have Chad Daybell and his wife, Tamara. Tamara is now also dead. It all seems a bit suspicious, doesn't it? All these murders, the disappearance of children, what's going on? What are Lori and Chad planning? Just 2 weeks after Tamara's death, Chad and Lori flew to Hawaii and got married there. From that moment on, Lori Vallow became Lori Daybell. Suspicion grew. The media began to slowly focus on the events in both families, while the police quietly watched from a distance. During their honeymoon, and even after their return to Rexburg, Chad and Lori began lying to the public. Chad said Lori never had children, and Lori said her daughter Tylee had died several years earlier. At the same time, on November 26th, the police decided to search Lori's house. The officers arrived and asked if they could see Joshua. Lori replied that he wasn't home. He had returned to Arizona with her friend Melanie. Just a few hours later, the Idaho police contacted the Arizona police and began working with them. When Melanie was asked about Joshua's whereabouts, she was surprised and said she hadn't seen the boy in weeks. She also told them that Lori and Chad had recently called and lied to her by staging a scene as if Joshua had been with them at the time. The police returned the next day with a search warrant for Lori's house, but Lori was no longer there, and neither was Chad. The newlyweds had flown to Hawaii. They remained silent whenever they came under the media spotlight. The police officially reported the two children missing. Authorities searched Chad's house with a warrant, seizing his computers, phones, and magazines, and demanded Lori bring Tylee and Joshua to the station within 5 days. Otherwise, she would be arrested. Lori's brother Alex also mysteriously died on December 12th. Amidst all these strange events, probable cause of death was a blood clot, or as some investigators would call it, natural death. Lori's time was up, but she didn't hand over Tylee or Joshua to the authorities. She remained silent, and the children's whereabouts remained unknown. On February 20th, 2020, Lori was finally arrested and jailed. The most important questions remained unanswered. Where are the children? Where could they be? And who was responsible for their disappearance? Family and friends felt the process was moving very slowly. Although all leads pointed to Chad and Lori, Chad was still at large as there was no solid evidence of his guilt. 4 long and arduous months passed. On June 9th, 7 a.m., the Rexburg police were at Chad's front door. They had another search warrant for the house. Just a few hours later, investigators discovered something gruesome. Unidentified human remains in the middle of the property. A few days later, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains belonged to Tylee and Joshua. The question of the children's disappearance was finally answered. Tylee's family was inconsolable. During those long months, they had hoped nothing terrible had happened to the children, but the truth was shocking. Around 11 a.m. on the day the remains were discovered, Chad Daybell was arrested as he tried to flee. He didn't get far. He was apprehended about a mile from his house. He was taken to the Fremont County Jail, where he was charged with 2 felonies, concealing a crime and tampering with evidence. His trial is yet to take place. This story continues. Lori and Chad are still behind bars, awaiting their trial. Although the police said they should be charged with first-degree murder, they were initially held on much lesser charges. By the way, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, would also be in jail if he were still alive. Investigators found that on the day Tylee was last seen in the national park, Alex returned to Lori's house at 2:40 a.m. and stayed there until early morning before heading to Chad's house and staying there for 2 hours. The coordinates also showed that Alex was at Chad's house again after Joshua's disappearance. After the children disappeared, several witnesses reported that Lori began referring to the children as zombies, those she considered dark and followers of Satan. Lori and Chad seemed captivated by the ideas of their religious cult. They were in love, and when two monsters meet, unfortunately, nothing good can be expected. Investigations suggest Lori ordered her brother Alex to kill her husband Charles because she was fed up with him. Tylee witnessed Charles's death, so she was not meant to live. Joshua was not Lori's biological son, though she no longer cared for him. And Chad killed his wife Tamara when he met Lori and fell in love with her. It wouldn't even surprise me to hear that Lori and Chad also killed Alex, who was an accomplice in previous crimes. At the end of May 2021, the couple was charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, aggravated theft by deception, and first-degree murder of Tylee, Joshua, and Chad Daybell's ex-wife Tamara. However, the trial against the couple has been postponed several times. Lori and Chad's attorneys filed several motions with the judge of the 7th Judicial District during the hearing, including a request to postpone the trial to 2024. The attorneys also requested to drop the death penalty for Chad Daybell. The judge denied some of the motions, such as postponing the trial, stating he would later provide a written response to the remaining motions. Lori was deemed competent after undergoing psychiatric treatment. then declared incompetent, and finally found competent again. On March 21, 2023, a judge lifted the death penalty for Lori Vallow as new DNA evidence was found, discovered too close to the trial to be tested, and admitted in court. Finally, on May 12th, Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty on all charges in a courtroom in Boise, Idaho, and sentenced to life imprisonment. In November 2023, Lori was extradited to Arizona to face murder charges there. In April 2024, she will face trial on suspicion of murdering the ex-wife of her fifth husband. Her fifth husband is also on trial for suspected triple murder. Thank you for watching, and take care.
The glamour of bohemian life, the stage, and wealth cloud the mind. This veil becomes even thicker when seasoned with a hefty dose of alcohol, illicit substances, and vanity. The fashion, beauty, and entertainment industries have always attracted beautiful people whose outward attractiveness, however, concealed unpleasant personalities. Beautiful people fighting for their place in the sun were at the forefront of a thriving, illicit substance-fueled society in the mid-1980s. It's not surprising that many stories had sad endings, but by no means all of them were as spectacular as the events surrounding Terry Broom. All of this happened in Milan, Italy's largest city. Furthermore, the city, along with Paris and New York, was the center of world fashion. Local photo studios and agencies attracted women from all over the world during this era. In the mid-1980s, this place became especially popular with American women. Terry Broom came from the USA, hoping to become famous on the catwalk. Here, everything was in the hands of wealthy men who were keen to meet young women and lure them into their lavish lifestyles. Aspiring models who had come here to pursue their dreams. This was precisely the atmosphere Terry found herself in. In the 1980s, it was common for Milanese to use agencies' offices in New York. They could even pay for a pretty woman's plane ticket and lend her enough money to get by in her new location for a month or two to establish herself. It was risky, but worth it, because if a woman found the right path, she could earn between 200 and 4,000 a day. In Milan, you could also gain experience that enriched your portfolio and was very valuable. Thanks to recommendations and a strong resume, a model could then continue her career in Paris or New York. This is how many international stars got their start. When Terry Broom came here, she immersed herself in a fiercely competitive environment. Not only did the models have to give part of their fees to the agency that helped them relocate, every woman had to stay in shape, always and everywhere, follow a strict diet, and restrict herself in many ways to be as attractive as possible. There was no other way to compete. Indeed, only a few in the modeling business possess the looks, character, and charisma necessary to market themselves. Most simply get lost in the vast mass of applicants. Therefore, most need support and connections to become famous. In addition to beauty and charisma, a model also needs to make contacts. This means not only constant visits to studios, advertising agencies, television and production offices, and magazine photo shoots, but also immersion in the nightlife of Milan. Wealthy men who could really help moved in these circles. You could meet them in luxurious apartments, restaurants, expensive nightclubs, and country houses. When Terry arrived in Milan, she was 26 years old. She had a rather long history of failure in the modeling business behind her. In fact, before her trip to Italy, she had tried to establish herself as a model in her home country, the USA. But it hadn't worked out. The trip to Milan was another difficult and extremely controversial period in her life. She blamed her family for it, above all. Terry was one of 5 children in the Broom family. Her mother was a housewife. Her father served in the U.S. Army. She grew up in a difficult environment, as they moved frequently when her father was transferred. Terry always thought her younger sister Donna was more beautiful and popular and envied her, which weighed heavily on her. Her father was an army sergeant and raised his children like soldiers. Corporal punishment was commonplace in the family. Later, she recalled how her father would throw her against the wall and hit her, as if she were grown-ups. But he knew how to do it secretly, to inflict pain without leaving a mark. Terry always believed she was his favorite victim. At 15, she ran away from home for the first time to escape the violence. She began hitchhiking, traveling through South Carolina in the hope of finding herself. Among the people she met along the way were 2 motorcyclists. They initially gave her a ride, promising her a ride, but then raped her and abandoned her. Terry then reached the nearest bus stop, met another man, and tried to ask for help, but he, too, attacked her with malicious intent. Terry barely managed to fight him off. After these traumatic experiences, the 15-year-old returned home, where she received only a cold welcome. Her father declared that she deserved it, since such a thing had happened to her. The girl once again found herself in an environment reminiscent of military training. This continued until she was 18, when she made another attempt to escape her abusive father. Terry married her school friend, Mike Smith, but their relationship did not last long, and the couple later divorced. Her younger sister, Donna, was already living in New York at the time and beginning a modeling career. She was successful from the start. For Terry, this job was a dream, another way to escape the violence. She moved in with her sister, and even tried to gain a foothold in a similar industry. But the response she hoped for never materialized. Finding work was almost impossible. Even at this time, she began to envy Donna, considering herself too tall and clumsy, and her freckles bothered her. Her facial features no longer seemed as beautiful and harmonious. In light of her failures in New York, Terry began to indulge in excessive pleasures, taking refuge in alcohol, and even trying banned substances. She developed an alcohol addiction. It even got to the point where she was drinking a whole bottle a day. In 1972, Donna decided to move to Paris. Terry followed her. At first, everything looked much better than in New York. It seemed as if the young talent would soon become world famous. But after a few weeks, all the jobs were forwarded to Donna. Terry followed her like a shadow and came away empty-handed. It turned out that she was known only as Donna's sister. In light of these failures, she returned to New York. Here, too, Terry remained in the shadows. In 1980, she even attempted to voluntarily leave the world. Fortunately, she survived this tragic incident and returned to her family in South Carolina. There, her mother tried to help her break her bad habits, but her friends from New York regularly contacted her. Terry could rarely say no to them. Instead, she met up with them again, got drunk, and had fun. Rehabilitation with her mother's help was not easy and took some time. However, after several setbacks, Terry managed to pick herself up. She found a job as a waitress and saved money for her dream. She even saved enough money to try her luck again. She decided to join Donna again, believing this was her last chance to build a modeling career. At this time, her sister was already building a modeling career in Milan. Terry decided her moment had come. She would finally achieve success. She arrived in the city on April 20, 1998. Terry had about $1,000 in cash with her, which she carried everywhere in her purse for fear of losing it. But the very next day, her purse was stolen by a pickpocket on the subway. Terry was left penniless. So, she became completely dependent on her sister again and moved into her apartment. Donna was in a relationship with a wealthy businessman at the time. Terry, with all her habits and her tendency toward disorder, intruded on her life. Donna sometimes complained that she spent so much time keeping her apartment in order. Her older sister was constantly throwing things around. She couldn't put up with this chaos for long and put Terry up in a hotel. There, wealthy businessmen hunted for women to pick up a beauty for the night. Some hoped for a more serious relationship. On her first date, Terry met a 38-year-old playboy named Claudio Catcher. He became her ticket to Milan's luxurious nightlife. Thanks to him, she visited all the city's sights and dined in the most expensive cafes, restaurants, and trendy bars. But she didn't really make much progress in the modeling business. However, success and the catwalk quickly faded into the background when Terry was confronted with her old enemy, her addictions. Here, for the first time, she saw a whole tray of white powder being passed around by the guests. She quickly became addicted to illegal substances, but, as before, she didn't believe she had any problems. Donna was indeed successful at this time. She got good contracts, earned a lot of money, traveled with her wealthy boyfriend, and visited expensive restaurants, but limited herself to one glass of alcohol. Her sister, on the other hand, was a regular at such establishments during this time. In addition to alcohol, she constantly consumed illegal substances in large quantities. For days, she dreamed of finally getting a good job, and at night, she was high when she was transferred from one bed to another. However, she once again managed to convince herself that she would succeed. Terry told one of her friends that even if this didn't happen, she would simply find a rich man and live a life of luxury. This seemed realistic to her when she met a wealthy man named Giorgio Rotti. He owned a jewelry store on one of Milan's main streets. Unlike others, he treated Terry well. However, this man, too, was addicted like most wealthy Milanese. According to the young woman, he sometimes drove a car and took illegal substances. Despite this, he behaved much better than others. Giorgio even introduced her to his parents, which in Italy is a sure sign that a man is serious. At the beginning of June 1998, she finally moved in with Giorgio and was very excited about this event, which she often told Donna about. However, all this couldn't go on forever. Terry Broom and Francesco D'Alessio first met in the spring of 1981. At that time, both were so immersed in this dissolute lifestyle that the young woman later recalled it as a time like dancing with death. The main problem was the systematic consumption of illegal substances, pills and alcohol. Francesco D'Alessio was a typical representative of Milanese bohemians, a very rich, handsome man, but not one who had earned his fortune himself. His father, Carlo D'Alessio, owned the most successful stud farm for thoroughbred racehorses in Italy. Francesco owed his wealth to this man. Of course, like most representatives of the golden youth, he appreciated it little. Instead of maintaining and increasing his family's wealth, he simply spent his money. Francesco surrounded himself with wealth, luxury goods, and wealthy friends. He always surrounded himself with models and was married to one. In fact, fate decreed that he would even spend the last seconds of his life in the company of models. Not only did he come from a wealthy family himself, but he also had just such friends. Among them were Guido Borgi, whose family manufactured refrigerators, the son of the powerful financier Carlo Cabassi, and Umberto Caproni, who was well known in the aviation industry. They cared little for any kind of work, but an evening was considered wasted if they weren't at a popular party. Terry Broom still lived in a hotel in the city center. There were 2 rooms there, usually rented to women or occupied by men on the prowl. It was constantly teeming with wealthy people, looking for a woman to spend the night with. Most didn't mind. They all hoped to make contacts and do business this way. It was the easiest way and practically always worked. In the lobby, one could meet millionaires from all walks of life. The young men usually wooed their chosen ones. Quite generous. They showered them with gifts and money. But some were so direct that they almost took the women by force. No one noticed that they saw this as their only opportunity for advancement. Some even found husbands, but most expected a less than inviolable fate. As long as the models were young and beautiful, they met wealthy men, received gifts and a touch of fame, but ultimately, they were obsolete and uninteresting. In any case, the stakes were high. Many didn't realize that they were paying for all this with their intimacy. They believed that for this price, they would rise to the top. When Terry Broom entered this milieu, she had no idea that the rules of the game were largely dictated by the mafia. The gangsters were little interested in the model's success. All that mattered to them was the money. The underworld controlled most of the bars frequented by the women and their admirers. Of course, they were very familiar with the golden youth, who brought them huge profits. At that time, Milan was the true criminal capital of Italy. Many compared it to Chicago in the 1920s. The only difference was that the entrepreneurs of that era made their fortunes selling illegal substances. In Milan, as many journalists said, money flowed freely. Illegal substances of all kinds were available on almost every corner. It was primarily the golden youth who bought them. One of Francesco di Alessio's close friends, with whom he regularly met in clubs and discos, was Joe Moserati. The man was a well-known gangster and had the notorious reputation of being the king of black market dealers. It is not surprising that Terry Broom, who immersed herself in this bohemian life, also began using illegal substances. They first met Francesco at a trendy party she attended on the night of May 6th at the home of an influential financier. The party took place at the villa of a wealthy businessman in Casarec. He was known for organizing elegant and beautiful parties that could quietly turn into full-blown orgies with illegal substances and a whole host of models. This time, the orgy began after the man's assistants had retired. He prepared a whole tray of prohibited substances. Terry consumed some of them and lost control of herself. According to her, that very night, the party organizer and Claudio Catcher exploited her vulnerability and raped her. They later denied all allegations and claimed they had a consensual threesome. Francesco also wanted to participate, but fell asleep on the floor before anything got done. When the man woke up and learned that Terry had participated in a group sex orgy, he was upset. Francesco found Terry, woke her, and demanded sex from her. However, she had already regained consciousness, and afraid that her boyfriend might find out about the act, refused and left. Francesco was apparently not one of those people who could accept rejection. From that point on, he never missed an opportunity to show her his negative attitude. It was difficult to hide from him. They moved in similar circles and met often. At every opportunity, the man made hurtful remarks and unpleasant suggestions. Terry repeatedly complained to her friends about his behavior. It looked like stalking, but everyone thought they should just ignore him. He would stop in time. For Terry, his actions became a daily nightmare. It only got worse. Little by little, Francesco began to insult the young woman. She couldn't understand why he wouldn't leave her alone, not realizing that the man himself was in a similar situation. Like the failed model, he was deeply involved in illegal substances, and was therefore increasingly losing control of himself. To everyone who knew Francesco D'Alessio, he was a wealthy, charming 40-year-old man. Shortly before the time of these events, he had a beautiful wife and healthy children. He was successful in everything he did, and was extremely knowledgeable with horses. Only his father knew more about them. Yet Francesco had always been rude and stubborn, incredibly spoiled since childhood, which worsened when he encountered the world of illegal substances. He couldn't accept the word no. He once even punched an American woman in a nightclub because she refused to sleep with him. As he became addicted, he began behaving openly and dangerously. He wrecked cars, regularly slept in his clothes right in hotel lobbies, rarely shaved and barely washed, and made public scenes from which only money and relationships could save him. Women held a special place in his life, but many believed he had never truly loved. Some friends recounted that Francesco had developed several sadistic tricks he used to make models fall in love with him, then abandon them just to hurt them. As the man's life began to fall apart, he grew to hate women. He could abandon even the most beautiful companion on a whim, without explanation. Gambling, which Francesco also loved, became a kind of synonym for his pursuit of self-destruction. By the time he met Terry Broom, he was already convinced that nothing in life was important except pleasure. His favorite saying was, "Life is a bet I'm willing to lose." On June 25, 1998, Terry, along with her beloved Giorgio Rotti, met her sister and her sister's boyfriend. They were sitting at a popular restaurant. There, Terry noticed Francesco. She sensed he was about to misbehave again and wanted to prevent it. She persuaded the whole group to go to another establishment, certain he would ruin everything again. But they didn't make it in time. At 8:00 a.m., Francesco came over and greeted the group with another unpleasant remark. Terry had already consumed a considerable amount of alcohol. When she saw him, she went to the ladies' room, hoping he would lose interest and leave. Instead, Francesco waited until she came out and then walked around the table where the group was sitting, making awkward jokes about Terry's penchant for group sex. Terry's friend didn't seem to fall for these provocations. Soon, everyone left the club. On the way home, however, the friend, with a disgruntled expression, asked Terry to return his gifts. She realized that the scene with Francesco could ruin her life, which had just begun, unaware that her friend had actually behaved this way several times before. When she got home, the man went to sleep, but Terry couldn't. She was too excited to distract herself. She searched the closets in the apartment, hoping to find games that would calm her down. But instead, she found a .38 caliber revolver. Then a terrible plan occurred to her. She called Francesco, pretending to be Diana, and asked to meet him. He agreed, and she drove to the specified address. The man was not alone in his villa, but in the company of another woman. He immediately suggested to Terry, whom he did not recognize at first, that she go into the bedroom and sleep with him, but she refused. He then made several unpleasant jokes in his style. Unwilling to tolerate this any longer, she took out her revolver and fired in his direction. The first bullet missed. The man lunged at her, but with the second shot, she hit him in the chest. Francesco managed to grab his attacker by the wrist. They fell to the ground together and began to struggle. Terry pulled the trigger 3 more times. The last bullet hit him in the temple. In the last minutes of his life, the man recognized the offended woman and realized that this was her revenge. When she noticed that the victim was no longer moving, she stood up, put the gun in her handbag, and left, after had calmed the victim's companion, who had been sitting in the next room the whole time. Terry explained that she didn't want to kill anyone, but had to teach Francesco a lesson, and that she had nothing to fear. As soon as the failed model candidate left, the woman woke Francesco's neighbor, who lived in the penthouse, and told him that Francesco was dying. While she called the ambulance and the police, The man carefully removed all traces of substances. He also approached several friends and told them about the incident. At that point, the victim was still breathing, but he only had a few minutes to live. When she returned home on the morning of June 26, 1984, Terry told her boyfriend what had happened. He reloaded the gun and put it back in the drawer. Terry called her sister, who immediately started screaming that she had been causing nothing but trouble since her arrival. Terry then began packing her suitcase, while her partner wiped the blood off her shoes, and then drove her to the airport. She had a return ticket to New York, but didn't want to return to the US, so she flew to Switzerland instead. There, the fugitive settled into a small apartment across from the police station. It wasn't long before they started looking for her and intending to arrest her. This wasn't difficult. Eventually, the woman was put out for questioning, found, and extradited to Milan. Journalists welcomed Terry Broom like a star. The Milanese public was shocked by what had happened, but not surprised. The murdered man had a bad reputation, and everyone knew that such an end was inevitable. But what the American model had done shocked everyone. Terry had no idea what a sensation her crime had caused. She immediately declared that she didn't mean to kill Francesco. She spent the next 2 years in prison awaiting trial. There, she became addicted to a drug prescribed by a member of the medical staff to help her overcome her other addictions. Terry attempted suicide twice, after which she was transferred to a more modern prison east of Milan. Here, she began to recover again. Terry Broom met a former terrorist who helped her improve her Italian and made life in prison easier for her. In addition to her cellmate, her mother and sister Donna also supported her. Remarkably, the murderer even benefited from journalists' interest in the sensational crime. Terry did indeed become famous, as she had dreamed, albeit not in the way she had hoped. When the trial took place, it became clear that the public was on the murderer's side. The 28-year-old Terry was seen as a victim of the men from the Milanese Beau, whom she blamed for her addiction. Her boyfriend was also charged, but received a short sentence of only a few months in prison. Her boyfriend, Giorgio, had put Terry in an uncomfortable situation, and after a meeting with Francesco, demanded the return of the gifts. In doing so, he had practically driven her to commit the crime. The trial resembled a theatrical performance. One of the lawyers even drew applause and tears from the audience when he portrayed Terry as the victim. The defense attorney claimed that Terry suffered from a temporary psychosis caused by the abuse of alcohol and illegal substances, which her friends in the clique had plied her with. Francesco's ex-wife stated that she did not hold the murderer responsible for her actions. She blamed the illegal substances for taking her husband. Terry herself stated that she did not mean to kill Francesco, but merely tried to scare him into leaving her alone. But that didn't work, and now she could do nothing to make up for his death. Instead, she wanted to try to change her own life. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted her of murder. Second-degree murder with mitigating circumstances. The murderer was sentenced to 12 years in prison, of which she had already served 3. Her lawyers attempted to appeal the sentence, but were unsuccessful. Journalists spoke to her several times. She seemed even more satisfied with her situation in prison than with her free life in Milan. Terry started every morning by making pottery, learned Italian, taught English to local women, and worked in the prison garden, for which she received about $100 a month. She even broke free from her addictions and looked tanned and fit. Terry spoke to the press repeatedly, stating that she had no regrets about the bohemian life she had left behind. She believed she had met much better people in prison and no longer aspired to a modeling career. In 199, Terry was released from prison. Her sister picked her up, and they left together. At first, she didn't plan to return to the USA, but instead tried to build a new life in Italy. But it didn't work out, and she later returned home. Terry leads a secluded life, starting from scratch and avoiding the cameras. Almost nothing is known about her life in freedom. Thanks for watching, and take care.
Friendship is no less complicated than a romantic relationship. Not everyone finds a true friend in their lifetime. A mistake can be so painful, even dangerous, that it can end in bloodshed. Anthony Dutcher was born on May 22, 1985, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The boy was active and versatile. He had many different hobbies. He seemed to find time for everything. He learned several musical instruments, languages, and martial arts. He loved nature, went hiking, and could even survive several nights alone in the woods. Tony wanted to combine his love of languages and his passion for martial arts in the future. He wanted to become a translator, join the military, or do something similar. Everyone who knew him described him as very friendly and sociable, family-oriented and ambitious. Tony always made time for his loved ones, including his grandparents, Carl and Joanna Dutcher. They lived in a rural area called Guffey in the state of Colorado, with about 100 inhabitants. Everyone knew each other there. It was always quiet and peaceful. Guffey was a 1.5-hour drive from Colorado Springs. Anthony loved coming to stay with them because his relatives lived in the heart of nature, where he could pursue his passion for exploring the world around him. The small town consisted of only a few dozen houses scattered over a large area. His grandfather, Carl Dutcher, was born in 1940. He served in the Army for 20 years and then worked as a machinist. He spent the last 13 years of his working life in government structures. Carl built a successful career. Joanna was his partner for almost his entire life. She was born in 1942 and worked as a beautician, nurse, and later as a saleswoman in a store. They had known each other since childhood, grew up together from the age of 7, fell in love and decided to join their lives together. This happened in 1964. From that moment on, the Dutchers were inseparable. The couple had 3 sons, Charles, Anthony, and James. After the IR retirement, the husband and wife settled in Guffey to spend their retirement in peace. Here they built a farm, began farming, and raised animals. Joanna was quite sociable and active. Carl, on the other hand, became a homebody and tried not to leave the house as much as possible. The husband enjoyed working on his land and was happy when his grandson came to visit. They even bought a small piece of land in the valley below the farm where Anthony could build himself a proper cabin. It was a place on a hilltop that offered beautiful views of the surrounding area, including the family farm. The schoolboy had built a shelter with his grandfather several years before the events described. At 15, he began visiting more and more often, which greatly pleased his family. He and his grandfather had much in common. All this contributed to a very warm relationship. New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2000. Anthony was 15 years old. He wanted to spend this holiday with his grandmother and grandfather, who were 60 and 58 years old respectively at that time. His parents wanted to travel, and therefore happily agreed. On the morning of December 31st, Anthony's parents took him to his grandparents' house, where preparations for the festive evening were already in full swing. Later, a friend of Anthony's, Isaac Grimes, also 15 years old, wanted to join them. The boys had been best friends for a long time. They had planned to go to Anthony's cabin to camp and spend the holiday. Shortly before midnight, Anthony's mother called him. They exchanged congratulations, fearing that the line would be busy at 12 o'clock and they wouldn't be able to reach each other. Mother and son chatted a bit and agreed to call on the morning of January 1st when everyone was awake. Tony promised to call as soon as he got up. He was usually awake early. However, when his mother got up in the morning, she didn't receive the promised call, and there was no message, which struck her as odd. Tony usually sent a congratulatory text message, which was supposed to arrive at night in case the lines were congested. But this one didn't arrive either. The woman wasn't worried because it was a vacation and a holiday. She also knew that the students were planning to go to a cabin where reception could be poor. The grandparents didn't call either, which worried the woman. She decided to contact them and ask what was going on, but they both ignored her calls. The mother tried several times to reach a relative, but no one answered until January 3rd, 2001. Unable to dispel her anxiety with excuses about camping and holidays, she contacted the police, asking them to check on her relative's well-being. The police officers responded immediately to the call. When they arrived at the scene, they found chaos. An external examination revealed signs of a break-in. Someone had entered the house through the back door. Inside, everything was in disarray. Many items were broken. When they reached the kitchen, the patrol officers found Carl Dutcher lifeless. The man was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, apparently shot. Someone had fired 2 bullets at him, hitting him in the chest. From that moment on, the officers drew their service weapons, as the perpetrator could still be in the house. There was no gun near the body. This appeared to be foul play, not a voluntary end to his life. Therefore, the officers' fears seemed well-founded. When they reached the hallway, they found the body of a woman in the bathroom, lying on a broken toilet. It was Joanna. She, too, was dead, lying in a large pool of blood. She had been shot. 6 bullets had struck the defenseless woman. It was obvious that this was a murder. It couldn't have been accidental. What worried the family most was that Anthony wasn't found in the house. The police sealed off the farm and began an investigation. They first wanted to find out where the teenager was. Perhaps he needed help. The mother confirmed that he was supposed to be staying with relatives at the time and shouldn't have gone home alone without warning. The teenager was reported missing and the search began. The Dutcher family was shaken by the incident and decided to go to Guffey to help search for Anthony. The mother told police about her son's plans to spend the night at a forest camp, but couldn't explain the location of the cabin over the phone, which is why they wanted to do it there. While the Dutchers drove to the parents' farm, detectives continued to examine the crime scene. It appeared to be a spontaneous attack, as if Carl had walked into the kitchen and been shot without warning. He didn't even have time to defend himself. The man had no defensive injuries. Joanna likely had a little more time to react. She was attacked. Her head was slammed against the toilet bowl and then shot. Unlike her husband, she was able to react. The woman's hand was shot through. Joanna likely instinctively tried to protect herself from the bullet that penetrated her palm and into her head, killing her instantly. Everything indicates that she was the second victim of the unknown perpetrators. She likely tried to hide in the bathroom, but without success. According to experienced criminalists, the victims had spent several days in the house. The bodies had already begun to decompose, which is why there was an unpleasant odor there. Both victims were wearing nightclothes, which means they were attacked either just before the Dutchers were about to go to bed or immediately after waking up. During the investigation of the house, a small jacket was found in the living room, on which a trace could be seen, as if someone had wiped a bloody knife on it. A holster was also found here, which was used for carrying a firearm. The pistol itself, however, was missing. Investigators concluded that these items must be connected. Family members of the Dutchers who arrived in Guffey reported that Carl was very interested in firearms. He owned several different NT models. He also bought various pistols and rifles, restored them, and resold them. This was his hobby. At the time of the crime, there were several dozen firearms in his house. Now it was time to find out exactly what had disappeared. The deceased's son helped clarify this question. The man shared his father's interest and had a rough idea of what he currently owned. This was an important clue, as the weapons were not kept openly, but in a specially designated locked gun safe. Finding this safe, opening it, and stealing the pistol required a targeted approach. This meant that the perpetrator had to know his victims well and know where the gun safe was located. Investigators began to examine the theory that the murderer was the missing grandson, Anthony. The teenager's fate was unknown until then. It was assumed that he had taken up arms for some reason, killed his relatives, and was now on the run. Tony's parents, however, immediately dismissed any possibility of such events. He said he loved his grandparents very much and had an excellent relationship with all of them. The teenager, who was not mentally ill, had never run away. There had been no problems with him in general. Tony had never been violent before. When the missing student's mother and father arrived, they were finally able to lead the police to the camp in the woods, where Anthony planned to camp. He wanted to celebrate in a cabin with his best friend Isaac. The mother was hopeful of finding her son's life. She suspected he was hiding there from a threat. The property was located about 500 meters from the house, on a hill obscured on all sides by dense vegetation. Several police officers with weapons, accompanied by the woman, went there. When the police looked inside, they immediately saw a sleeping bag apparently occupied by someone, and a little further away, another, empty one. Board games lay next to it. Unfortunately, the worried mother's hopes were not fulfilled. Anthony was there, but the boy had also died a gruesome death. The teenager's throat had been slashed so deeply that he was practically decapitated. The perpetrator had delivered a powerful blow to leave him no chance of survival. There was no sign of the teenager resisting. He was taken by surprise and stabbed in cold blood. Tony was killed with a single blow, apparently with full force. Investigators noticed something very disturbing. Given the precision and force, it was possible that this was not the first time the killer had done something like this. The actions appeared professional and routine. Despite all the police's efforts, they were unable to find a weapon that could have been used in the attack. The parents were interviewed extensively. They provided information about everything Anthony might have taken with him. The perpetrator had likely taken valuables that could help identify him. Among the items not found with the teenager was a watch that his grandparents had given him for the holiday. It was a rather expensive and eye-catching accessory, with a blue flame motif. On the same day, investigators discovered that another 15-year-old teenager named Isaac Grimes was also scheduled to participate in the camping trip. This explained why there was another sleeping bag and an open game in Anthony's cabin. At least 2 people had clearly been there. However, the sleeping bag was empty. Police officers then began searching for another possible victim. They first decided to go to the student's house, as he lived nearby. To their surprise, they found him there. 15-year-old Isaac Grimes personally opened the door for them. The teenager was alive and appeared unharmed. The student told investigators that he had indeed arranged to go camping with his friend on New Year's Eve to visit his friend's relatives. They were planning to go camping there. However, at the last minute, he canceled his date with Anthony because other friends had invited him to Colorado Springs for a drink. a party was being held there, organized by older students. Isaac decided to go. According to him, he never arrived at the Dutcher's house, never saw his best friend, and didn't know what had happened to him. Isaac was very upset when he was told about the deaths of Anthony, his grandmother, and his grandfather. But something about his behavior was disturbing. Unfortunately, Anthony's mother didn't know for sure whether Isaac had gone to his friend's house that evening. They hadn't discussed it during their phone call with her son, but she knew for sure that Isaac had been to the cabin with Anthony before. He had shown him his secret place. No one else was allowed to know about it. The investigators decided to verify his statement and find out who Isaac had gone to the party with that evening. The teenager very reluctantly revealed two names. He had been invited by two schoolmates, Jonathan Matheny and Glenn Urban, who were 17 and 18 years old, respectively. The police contacted the two teenagers, who both agreed to an interview, but their conversation revealed something astonishing. Their stories were so similar that it seemed as if the teenagers had carefully prepared and memorized narratives. They used the same phrases and phrasing as if they had memorized the sentences. All of this was atypical for such interrogations. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to hold any accusations against the young men. Evidence had to be found that connected them to the crime scene. In any case, the two older men and Tony's best friend came under suspicion. It was now unclear who owned the sleeping bag found next to Tony's body in his cabin. The autopsy report soon arrived. It turned out that all the victims, Carl, Joanna, and Anthony, had died on New Year's Eve. This suggested that the perpetrator had come specifically to kill all the family members living in the house, and that he knew where to find each one. This only confirmed that the man knew the Dutchers well, as practically no one knew the location of Tony's secret cabin and his grandfather's gun safe. This idea was further confirmed by the absence of weapons in Carl's house. The man had the habit of always taking a pistol with him before opening the door. It was even lying next to the front door. This may seem unusual, but for an American living in such isolation, it can be a matter of life and death. A gun can be useful for self-defense at any time. This habit was so deeply ingrained that the grandfather even welcomed his children and grandchildren with a gun. But for some reason, the man was caught off guard. Unfortunately, the killer, or killers, were very cautious and left no trace in the house. Given the distance between the house and the camp, it was assumed that Anthony was the first victim and was killed by one person. The robbery of the house could have been committed by someone else, as suggested by the changed behavior, different handwriting, and choice of weapon. However, these suspicions could not be proven. The investigation lasted 2 months, but no valuable clues had been found. On March 6, 2001, Isaac Grimes unexpectedly reported to the police. Fearing for his life, the 15-year-old teenager told a ludicrous story. He was being followed by a man with a shotgun who had shot his best friend's family. All of this might seem like the paranoia of a student overly impressed by the murder of 3 people. Against this backdrop, however, the investigators had renewed doubts. They decided to discuss the events of New Year's Eve once again. One of the investigators remembered the watch Tony's parents had mentioned. He was asked about it at a meeting with Isaac. Isaac said he had actually seen the accessory at his friend's house, which represented the most serious contradiction in the entire investigation. The watch had only been given as a gift on New Year's Day. Accordingly, Isaac could not have seen it if their meeting had indeed taken place shortly before midnight. This contradicted the suspense act's original statements. This meant that Isaac had been in the house and obviously knew something. It seemed as if things were finally moving forward. On March 8, 2001, the boy and his parents were summoned for an official interview. He continued to insist that he had not been at his friend's house on the fateful night. Then the police cleverly brought up the subject of the watch and exposed the teenager's lies, literally in front of his parents. It all culminated in an army jacket with traces of blood found in the victim's house. Finally, Isaac broke down due to the contradictions and obvious lies and confessed. The teenager recounted what had really happened that New Year's Eve. Isaac confessed that his classmate Jonathan Metheny had brought him to Anthony's house shortly before midnight. There the boys met, congratulated each other, and prepared for the celebration. Then they went together to the campsite, where they spent time as friends, playing games and telling stories. Anthony had no idea that his best friend had a knife with him. As the teenagers were about to go to bed, Isaac drew his friend's attention to the light in the window. He turned to look. Isaac approached his friend from behind, drew the knife, and stabbed Anthony with all his might, fatally. Later, the coroner was amazed that a 15-year-old student could inflict such a deep wound with a single stab. Isaac himself admitted that he had used all his strength. Then 17-year-old Jonathan Metheny showed up. He arrived at the Dutcher farm around 4 a.m. The boy had a rifle with him. He waited away from the house for Isaac to return. The two went inside the elderly couple's house and broke down the back door. The noise woke the residents. Joanna and Carl got up. The man went into the kitchen to see what was going on. Carl probably wanted to scare off the burglars, unaware that they had come to kill them. Jonathan shot the man first. Isaac just watched. After 2 shots, Carl immediately fell to the ground. Joanna, frightened, ran away and locked herself in the bathroom. She wanted to hide, but Jonathan didn't intend to leave any witnesses. The boy broke down the door, slammed the woman's head against the toilet, and then shot her. It's remarkable that all these horrific acts were committed by schoolchildren. Jonathan was 17 years old, Isaac only 15. According to Isaac, he simply followed his older friend and watched as he killed innocent people. The perpetrators knew about Carl's weapons and took several of them. They loaded them into the trunk of their car and simply drove off. Both drove to the house of Glenn Urban, the 18-year-old teenager, the oldest of the group. They gave him the knife and the rifle with which they had shot 2 people. He was supposed to clean up everything, thus becoming an accomplice. The police could not find a motive for the crime. Isaac stubbornly remained silent. Where the rifle came from also remained a mystery. Immediately after the confession of 15-year-old Jonathan Metheny, he was arrested. He denied his involvement in the triple murder. Then, Glenn Urban was arrested. He too resisted arrest for a long time. But finally, the high school student Glenn confessed that he had been tasked with destroying the weapon, but also provided another valuable clue. According to him, another teenager named Simon Sue, who was 18 at the time, was involved in the crime. According to Glenn, it was this young man who led the bloody massacre. Simon had selected the targets, directed the operation, and planned everything. He also explained how to eliminate traces of the crime. At his insistence, Glenn had to destroy the weapon. Therefore, the boy disassembled it and discarded the parts in various locations. During the entire investigation, the investigators heard the name Simon Sue for the first time. They immediately decided to speak to the other 2 people involved, but they stubbornly remained silent. It was revealed about the teenager that he had grown up very withdrawn and unloved, and that he had virtually no contact with others during his school years. He met Isaac, Glenn, and Jonathan in high school. Isaac and Simon were avid chess players and video gamers. This bonded them. All three were also unsociable and had almost no friends, yet desperately wanted to become more popular. After a while, all three fell under the influence of Simon, who promised them a better life. He immediately identified himself as a member of a secret organization and claimed to have contacts with the rebel army from Guyana. According to the description, all of this resembled the recruitment of students who had trouble socializing. They probably simply wanted to be part of something bigger. It then became clear that all of them had been deceived by Simon. Since joining this organization, they had to undergo special training that included shooting firearms and the correct technique for throat slitting. Simon gave them increasingly difficult and brutal tasks. It even went so far that he forced them to eat and drink to exhaustion, calling this torture a test of willpower. Eventually, the manipulator succeeded in confusing the young people so much that they could no longer imagine life without the organization and carrying out Simon's orders. The leader ran this club like a military organization. He gave each member a military rank and motivated them to serve him better. Simon forced the boys to give him a portion of their money. If they disobeyed, he punished them cruelly. The mentor's constant tasks included watching gruesome videos of real-life killings of animals and, later, people. At some point, however, Isaac showed dissatisfaction, as if he sensed he was doing something bad. Simon then declared him a traitor, threatened him with persecution and murder, and then demanded that he prove his loyalty to the group. All this happened under pressure from two older boys. Isaac was tasked with killing his best friend, Anthony, to prove his loyalty to the group. Jonathan was tasked with eliminating his grandparents. Both were to retrieve several weapons from Carl's house. Since they lived nearby, they knew about Carl's passion for restoring weapons and his gun safe. Thanks to Anthony, it wasn't difficult to find the location. But why was the Dutcher family chosen as the victims? The motive for the triple murder of these people remained a mystery. According to sources, Carl may have made an unpleasant remark to Simon. This could have provoked the hatred. However, there was no evidence for this. All the students, however, claimed that he incited them against Carl Dutcher for this reason. The real motive may have been the possession of firearms, which the perpetrator wanted to obtain for himself. When the police stormed Simon Sue's house with a search warrant, they were immediately able to confirm the statements of the other teenagers. In particular, they found several items that had been stolen from Carl. Everything looked as if preparations for a crime were indeed underway. Several dozen firearms were found on the leader. All of them were stolen in various robberies. Before the tragedy at the Dutcher farm, however, the robberies had not been violent. At least 36 pistols and rifles were found in the house, which now had to be examined. Despite being only 18 years old, the gang leader had his own warehouse where even more weapons, spare parts, and various stages of disassembly and ammunition were found. An entire arsenal was housed there, including AK-47s. According to the police, he could have armed a small infantry unit. Simon was taken in for interrogation. Although the young man was a quiet and unpopular person, he proved to be very cunning and cynical. He refused to admit his guilt and unhesitatingly accused Glenn, Isaac, and Jonathan of committing the crime and of only trying to make him a scapegoat. According to Simon, he was in Canada at the time of the robbery and therefore had nothing to do with the incident. Of course, the gang leader was lying. He denied having forced his friends to perform various extreme acts and described the club they allegedly belonged to as a purely entertainment community. He immediately began to say that all three accomplices had mental health and behavioral problems and described them all as aggressive. It was obvious that he had prepared well for his arrest. Ultimately, it was decided to try all perpetrators as adults for triple murder. Isaac Grimes pleaded guilty to the murder of his best friend, Anthony Dutcher. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 60 years. Jonathan Matheny and Simon Sue were charged with organizing criminal activity, planning murder, and illegal possession of a firearm. Jonathan was also charged with double murder. Ultimately, Jonathan received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 68 years. The instigator was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 53 years. Because Glenn had assisted the criminal gang and disposed of the murder weapon, he was sentenced to only 2 years. It was proven that he neither planned nor committed the crime, although he knew exactly what his friends were doing and did not help prevent the atrocities. Isaac's mother still can't believe that her son committed such a terrible crime. She doesn't understand how the kind, good-natured Isaac could have become a true monster under the influence of a dangerous manipulator. Isaac himself explains his involvement in the murder by saying he was intimidated and threatened. The teenager was threatened that his family would be killed if he didn't comply and play his part. Therefore, he was forced to stab his best friend. After beginning his prison sentence, Isaac wrote a letter expressing remorse for his actions. Some of Anthony's relatives don't believe his story of intimidation and believe that Isaac could have turned to the police. Then, no one would have been harmed. Neither Isaac's family nor the Dutcher family. The relatives of the murdered family consider the sentences too lenient. In their opinion, Simon and Jonathan deserve the death penalty for the brutal murder of innocent people. Anthony's mother declared that she forgave Isaac and even testified in his favor in court to reduce the sentence. The woman believes Isaac was a victim of Simon's manipulation. The mother was so distraught after her son's death that she even attempted suicide twice. She still writes letters to Isaac and feels compassion for him. Thanks for watching, and take care. Novosibirsk, Russia. A quiet and cozy evening in one of the houses was interrupted by a terrible thud. Then another followed. Someone tried to break into the house through the door. A grandmother and her granddaughter huddled together, waiting in fear. The unknown assailant smashed the door. An axe emerged. A day later, the neighbors discovered a horrific scene. A pensioner and her granddaughter, Tanechka, had been brutally murdered in their bedroom. This crime was the beginning of a terrible story that many still remember today. This time, we'll travel back to 1976, to the town of Skitum, and learn what led to a brutal criminal wreaking havoc in the city, literally burning pensioners and children alive. Novosibirsk is the third largest city in Russia. Unfortunately, it is known for its many serial killers and criminals. The most famous among them are Mikhail Yudin, nicknamed the Bertsky Maniac, Yevgeny Chuprinsky, Viktor Fokin, and many others. Today we're talking about a serial killer who left his name in this city's bloody history. June 16, 1989. On that day, a man was walking through the park. His attention was caught by smoke rising from the bushes. The passerby smelled a strong, unpleasant odor. He covered himself with his scarf and decided to see what was burning. As he got closer, he noticed that the fire was almost out. Inside lay a heavily charred human corpse. After his deed, the monster had tried to cremate his victim, but had failed. The executioner had hoped that only a handful of ash would remain, but a great deal had survived. Experts were able to determine that a very young person, almost a teenager, had burned to death in the fire. It wasn't immediately possible to determine whether it was a boy or a girl. The body had multiple stab wounds in the neck and back. Earrings were found among the charred remains. This allowed investigators to determine that it was a girl. Law enforcement officials inquired about Skitum and received a response. Natalia Rowe, Denikova's parents had filed a missing persons report with the police the day before. The girl was only 17 years old. When investigators approached her parents and showed them the earring, they immediately recognized it. Investigators immediately began looking for motives. At first, the theory of robbery was considered, but all the valuables were found in the same fire. They began checking acquaintances. It was suspected that a young man could have committed such a heinous act against the backdrop of a conflict. Investigators discovered that Natalia was very popular with boys. 17-year-old Natalia Rodnikova was cheerful, sociable, and pretty. According to acquaintances, she flirted with many people, but rejected them all. Many boys were angry with her. This made the task more difficult. Natalia's friends said that among all the rejected boys, David Akopian stood out. He allegedly shouted loudly that the girl would regret everything because Natalia had seriously injured him and his entire family. Investigators considered the boys' threats harmless, rather emotional. Nevertheless, they decided to investigate David. During interrogation, it emerged that he had no alibi at the time of Natalia's murder. When they tried to take him away, he even resisted, grabbed a stick, and attacked the officers. During interrogation, David chose not to defend himself. He said, "Think what you want." The boy's reaction seemed strange. The officers decided to keep the suspected teenager in the cell until the investigation was completed. A few hours later, David's father appeared at the police station. He shouted that he would not leave until they released his son. When they tried to calm the enraged man, he shouted, "I will prove that there are no criminals in my family. I will freeze to death here, and then you can be ashamed of yourselves." David's father spent the whole night in front of the police station. In the morning, he collapsed. A police officer rushed to him and offered help. The police officer simply replied that he knew what to do and that he would help with the investigation. A few hours later, the man brought a 12-year-old boy to the police station. As it later turned out, on the day of Natalia's death, the boy had seen a suspicious car at the exact spot where her body was found. He became the key witness in this terrible story. The boy's name was Oleg Zhukov. During interrogation, he said that he had seen a yellow Moskvich that day near the park. The right windshield wiper was broken. Music was coming from the car, and a man was sitting inside. He told me, "Get out of here," and I walked away. Investigators immediately began checking all the yellow Moskvich cars in the city. The color was rare, so there were only a few of them. One of the drivers immediately stood out. When the man was shown the victim's photo, he was very confused. He asked for paper and a pen and later said, "I knew they would find me." The man began writing a confession but suddenly suffered a heart attack. Almost a week later, he came to in the hospital and the doctors allowed the police to continue their conversation with the suspect. They asked him to finish what he had started, which ultimately sent them into shock. The driver wrote on a piece of paper, "I accidentally hit a girl with dark hair. She fell, I got scared, and drove away. I am ready to accept the punishment for my crime." The investigators were confused. What did that mean, hit a girl? They had tried to burn her. They suspected that the driver's victim might not have been Natalia at all. They began calling hospitals and eventually found the injured woman. More than a week ago, a young woman from the area who enjoyed drinking came to the hospital with bruises. She said she had been hit by a car, but no one believed her. The driver's victim survived, but the driver suffered a heart attack. The investigators weren't happy about this information. They had to start from the beginning. At that moment, a new, no less horrific crime occurred. In early July 1989, the Dorofeev family was going to the zoo. They had no idea that this day would be a fateful one for their family. 11-year-old Masha went into the yard to wait for her parents. However, when the couple came out, they couldn't find their daughter. She had disappeared without a trace. Everyone was looking for Masha: relatives, neighbors, the police. For more than 2 days, no one knew anything. The girl was found very close to the house, in some bushes. They had tried to cremate her. The burns were not severe, and the experts were able to fully reconstruct the picture of the crime: a gag in her mouth, knife wounds in her back, and bound hands and feet. The investigators concluded that both murders were the work of the same killer. They came to this conclusion not only because both victims were burned, but also because their hands and feet were bound in the so-called swallow position. This involves the feet being tied together and pulled towards the hands. Natalia's rope burned in the fire, but based on her body position, investigators determined that she too was bound in the swallow position and had a gag in her mouth. The motive soon became clear. The experts determined that the perpetrator had abused both victims before killing them and attempting to burn them. The experts determined that the victims were still alive at the time of the burning. In 1979, the insane Yuri Ivanov was already at work in Novosibirsk. He killed women with a saber. Law enforcement agencies searched for him for over a year. But had a serial killer really reappeared in the Siberian city 10 years later? Unfortunately, this suspicion was confirmed. 3 days later, the executioner went on the hunt again. 12-year-old Svetlana was found in a wooded area not far from the factory where her parents worked. She was on her way to visit them. They had arranged to meet, but her parents didn't see her. She never did. EK later, there was another crime. This time, a librarian was the victim, almost in the same spot. The woman was on her way to her husband. Only a few hundred meters separated them. Both victims were also tied in the swallow position. As was later determined, passers-by had heard screams, but they could not interpret them as cries for help. 4 victims in such a short time. An urgent order came from Moscow to catch the perpetrator immediately, or the entire leadership would be dismissed. Wanted posters were posted all over the city. Citizens were warned that a madman was on the loose in the city. Law enforcement agencies worked day and night to find even a single valuable witness. Soon, an idea occurred to the investigators. Since all the victims were tied up in a special way, the perpetrator might have some connection with law enforcement. If he was one of them, it would be difficult to catch him. All the police officers knew the status of the investigation. They also knew where to look for the killer, but it was imperative to catch him. Panic grew in the city. Women and girls were afraid to go out on the streets. Parents wouldn't let their children leave the house. But a big city can't stay at home. The women continued to go to work, the children to school. There were only minor precautions. People walked on well-lit streets. A few days later, there was another attack, this time near the town of Iskitim. The victim was 18-year-old Irina Astagova. The girl was walking home from the station, and there was no sign of trouble. It was daytime. Bright. The streets were crowded with people. A slight man walked in front of her. He turned around and offered to help Irina carry her heavy bag home. As they walked through a hedgerow, Irina heard a noise as something fell to the ground. She turned around and saw the man throw the bag away and approach her with quick steps. The man grabbed the young woman by the neck and pulled her into the bushes. From Irina's testimony, I came to when he was tying me up. At that moment, passers-by came past the bushes. He held a knife to my throat and ordered me to be silent. She was incredibly lucky. A crowd poured out of a train that had just arrived. The madman whispered in her ear, "I'll be back," and ran away. The frightened and tied-up Irina was finally able to scream. A few minutes later, Irina was already giving her statement. The investigators carefully examined the crime scene and finally got lucky. They found drops of blood. Thanks to these, the doctors were able to determine the blood type. This is how the first physical evidence emerged. It turned out that the perpetrator had accidentally cut himself while removing the knife. The blood type narrowed the circle of suspects, but not much. At first, everyone was checked, as it was suspected that the perpetrator was a member of the police force. Furthermore, the suspicion that a police officer was involved was confirmed, but no suspects could be found. While investigators searched for the killer was looking for a new victim. A few hours after the attack, across town in Iskitum, a ninth grader was walking home on his usual route when he suddenly noticed strange debris in the bushes. A handbag was lying on the street. The teenager, having heard about the killer, didn't hesitate, grabbed a stick and called out to the man. When the boy heard this, he ran away. A girl lay at the crime scene. She was still alive, but crying violently. The victim's name was Larissa, and she was 18 years old. Despite the horror she had experienced, she remembered the man well. A gifted artist since childhood, she had been a talented artist, and investigators soon obtained a detailed portrait of the attacker. The arrest warrant, including the portrait, was immediately printed and published in the newspaper. Within a few hours, the notice was posted throughout the city. People began calling. Some had seen a suspicious man on the street, others on the subway. Ends of leads were checked daily. Some men were arrested, checked, and released again. The killer was not among them. It was assumed that he was hiding or had gone into hiding due to the commotion. But no, he soon struck again. 17-year-old student Anya was found in a park. The girl was also tied up in a swallow's cage. Only unlike the previous victims, she was no longer alive. Investigators followed the monster's trail, but it refused to calm down. He had to be caught urgently, otherwise the number of victims would continue to rise. It was decided to catch the killer using live bait. Officers selected several girls who roughly matched the victim's type and followed them closely. The likelihood of such measures being successful is usually low. Criminals rarely fall into such traps. Moreover, it posed a huge danger to the girls themselves. The live bait method proved unsuccessful. Then the investigators decided to take a different approach. Instead of hiding and trying to catch the killer, they would search for him on the streets during the day. Officers scoured the entire city, searching for the suspect. All services were mobilized for such measures. Over 1,000 people were checked. The special operation in Novosibirsk was called Lesopolosa, Forest Strip, just like one of the most famous Soviet manhunt operations in the Rostov region to arrest Chikatilo. Back then, the work took 5 years. However, investigators in Novosibirsk wanted to find the killer much faster. Every day, several dozen men were checked. Anyone who even remotely resembled the composite sketch, anyone who behaved even the least bit suspiciously. And then, on one of those days, the police noticed a man who vaguely resembled the composite sketch and was trying to hide his face. When the officers approached him, he suddenly took off running. A chase ensued. The man ran into a courtyard and literally disappeared. It was a long way to the entrance. There were no cars nearby, but there was one small Whitney SS. The boy said he saw an uncle running into a transformer shed. The door wasn't locked. When the police officers entered, they arrested the fugitive. The man showed his ID, an outstanding participant in socialist labor competitions. When asked, "Why did you run away?" he couldn't answer. During the search of the suspect, a knife and a rope were found. Was this really the madman who had terrified the entire city and region? There were 3 men in the cell. One had escaped, the second had tried to beat a police officer, the third had harassed a woman. None of them resembled the murderer, the investigators found. But that was only at first glance. When they took a closer look at the first escapee, they discovered a rounded shoulder, just like in the photo. They spoke to each of them. Everything was fine, even with the one who slightly resembled the composite sketch, a man named Kozlov. He was married, had a child, and had a criminal record. But back then, many had criminal records. There was another factor: blood type. The fugitive matched the blood type of the sample taken at the time. It was decided to call the victim in for identification. As soon as the young woman entered the office, she immediately pointed at her tormentor. The suspect collapsed. Fyodor Kozlov, one of the best welders in the Novosibirsk region, an excellent worker and an exemplary family man, began to recount how he had tortured each of his victims. Incidentally, the criminal had changed his appearance considerably, as his wanted poster was posted on every corner. Kozlov grew his hair and a beard. Fyodor Kozlov did not immediately become a murderer. At first he was a good student and read a lot. He was born on April 9, 1959, in the village of Semiyarsk. Shortly after his birth, the family moved to the Rostov region, where Fyodor spent his childhood and youth. During his school years, Kozlov was fond of geography. Because of his introversion, he was unpopular in his community and was considered a social outcast at school. As a result, in the mid-1970s he lost interest in learning, and his relationship with his parents deteriorated rapidly. They never praised their son for his efforts, and were even pleased when the student spent more time on the streets than on his textbooks. As a teenager, Fyodor began to display aggressive behavior toward those around him and signs of mental illness. For this reason, in the early 1970s, he was sent to live with his grandmother in the Semipalatinsk region. According to one version, the teenager himself sought contact with his relative. While staying with his grandmother in the countryside, Fyodor developed a special affection for his cousin. She frequently complained that her brother harassed her. His grandmother often scolded her grandson, which provoked increasing anger in him. In early 1976, in a state of inner tension, Fyodor lost control, grabbed an axe, and caused severe damage to the house. Amid this outbreak, a dramatic escalation occurred. His grandmother was killed and his cousin became a victim of his violence. That same year, Kozlov was arrested. The Rostov Regional Court found him guilty on all counts and imposed the maximum sentence possible for a minor in the USSR: 10 years in prison. After serving his entire sentence, he was released in 1986 and moved to the Novosibirsk region. There he settled in the village of Lozhok, where he married a woman he had met while in prison. Shortly thereafter, their son was born. When his wife temporarily moved with the child to live with her parents in the nearby village of Evzino, tensions between the couple remained. During this time, Kozlov began to develop a dark side again. On June 16, 1989, a tragic incident occurred. 18-year-old Natalia Rodnikova was returning home when she met him. Fyodor later explained to investigators that he had lost control of his inner impulses, exacerbated by the tensions in his marriage, which eventually broke up. The media soon gave him frightening nicknames. Some called him the Satan of Novosibirsk, others the Iskitim murderer. It's noteworthy that at that time, Kozlov regularly sharpened a knife in front of his colleagues. When they jokingly asked if he meant to eliminate someone, he laughingly replied, "Yes." No one took those words seriously. He appeared calm, unobtrusive, and familiar on the outside. Hardly anyone would have suspected the reality hidden behind this facade. Even during the trial, Fyodor remained convinced that he would be found not guilty due to his mental state. His greatest fear was not the justice system, but the reaction of the victims' families. Therefore, he always stayed close to the investigators during interrogations. But his hopes were not fulfilled. He was found fully guilty, and the Novosibirsk court sentenced him to death on April 23, 1990. However, the sentence was never carried out. On September 1st of that year, Kozlov was found dead in his cell. The circumstances indicate that he had decided to end his life himself. Thanks for watching, and take care.